What if I told you that your throwing program could be potentially putting you at a higher risk of injury? Would you believe me? In this episode, we're talking about RPE. And I'm going to showcase to you how measures like RPE could be putting you at a higher risk of injury. Let's go talk about RPE today. We have an entire study focused today on what is RPE, is it a reliable measure or is it not? So our team has built the spreadsheets, we've got the guys ready to go. We're about to start tracking and trying to understand, is RPE a reliable measure in throwing programs or is it not? Let's define RPE. Come on over, I'm gonna show you something real quick. So let's do a quick Google search. So the definition of RPE is pretty simple. It's rate of perceived exertion. RPE is used to measure how hard your body works during physical activity. It runs from 0 to 10 using numbers to rate how much effort and activity takes. So one of the things when we start rating activity, how stressful was something, how much work was something, we start to blur the lines a little bit when we start to understand how we quantify something like a 10. Is it my feelings that are giving me that 10 or is it the actual work that I did that's giving me that 10? There are research articles out there that say RPE is unreliable and there are research articles that say it's reliable. And what you see quickly across all these research papers is it's the type of activity that they're measuring matters. Predicting is something more of a 10 than a 1, depends on the type of activity that we're actually doing. With something like throwing is so intricate. There are different body types, there's different arm speeds, different limb lengths. All of these things matter when we're trying to determine how much work did somebody potentially do throwing. And when we start to extrapolate that over 6 months, 4 months, 3 months in terms of throwing programs, trying to build somebody up, any overestimating or underestimating of the amount of work that somebody's doing can pose a serious problem to the risk of injury for that athlete. Today, our whole work, we've got our spreadsheets up, we've got our guys out there, we're ready to go, ready to start collecting data. Our whole goal is to determine, is RPE reliable? Do our guys have a comprehension of what velocity they're throwing at, what percentage they're throwing at with that specific velocity? So we're gonna take their peak velocities of all time, and we're going to take 50% of that actual peak velocity. Then we're gonna take 70% of that actual peak velocity. We're gonna measure that out and determine, are these guys actually throwing at 50%? Are they actually throwing at 70%? Are they actually throwing at 100%? And then we're gonna gauge, did they scale those velocities well? We're gonna do two throws at 50%, 70%, 100%, and we're gonna see how these guys do. Let's test it out. All right, listen up. Do a little research project today. We're gonna look and see how you guys do with percentages. What's 70%? What's 50%? Why is that? How do we use that verbiage? What does that mean to you guys? How does that actually work in our throwing process? When I say 50%, intensity is probably not something we really totally comprehend. So when you see throwing programs that are not based on the sleeve, that are based upon exertion, RPE, what do you guys think, right? Guys are probably throwing a lot more in terms of workload today because they have no clue what intensity actually looks like. 70%, 100%, turn it loose, let's freaking go. Turn it loose. Oh yeah. 79.1, let's go Daniel. 88. Turn it loose, have some fun. Let's go Landon, do it. Come on Landon. 92.3. Let's go, Coop. 75.4. Chuck it, we got 2. There we go. So yesterday we collected on 18 different athletes. We completed what we called our RPE project. So today, I want to present to you guys what we found. Built a little PowerPoint here, let's go over it. So our study had 18 different athletes. All of these athletes were high school level players, and we asked each player to go over 6 different pitches. We did 2 throws at 50%, 2 throws at 70%, and 2 throws at 100%. When we first got started on this project, our staff wanted to ask the question constantly, is RPE a reliable metric or is it not? I think this study is pretty conclusive, so I'm excited to get to it. We said the average 100% throw for our athletes. So when we looked at all of the athletes and their reported max velocities, the average 100% max velocity for our athletes was 85.7 miles per hour. Most studies that you read online, most research that you look at, the overall average velocity or just the overall peak velocities even at times don't reach this high. So we have a great group of subjects here, 18 individual high school athletes throwing 85 miles an hour on average. When we looked at the difference basically between the athletes that were throwing, so our recorded 100% and what the athletes reported as their 100%, we saw that these athletes were negative 3.8 miles per hour down from their reported 100% on average. Now, if you know anything about throwing, not every day you're gonna PR. So the 100% that we were getting from our athletes was their PR, their highest recorded velocity. In this case, on our testing day, these athletes were throwing at about 4 miles per hour down from that reported max. And that's important. When we think about RPE, especially like strength and conditioning, a 1 rep max is how you calculate back the percentages for RPE. So in this case, we used their max to calculate 70% and 50%. Reality though is that these athletes will fluctuate on a day in and day out basis. That 1 rep max will be different day in and day out, and you see that here. So let's move on to 70%. What we saw in our calculated 70% of our athletes max, we saw that on average 70% was about 64.3 miles per hour. So with this, how did our athletes do? Average amount off the calculated 70%. So the average amount the athletes were away from that recommended or calculated 70% was about 8 miles per hour over. So this is interesting if you stop and think about it here, right? When we talked about 100%, we said that 100% our athletes were 4 miles per hour under. When we talk about a calculated 70% of that max, of that 100%, our athletes were 8 miles per hour over. So what we see a lot with our athletes is their 70% effort and their 100% effort, the way that they feel those efforts are pretty darn close. Reality is though, when we calculated it, we would want our athletes to be a lot more under what they actually throw at 70%. So again, the average amount off for the calculated 70% is gonna be 8 miles per hour over in our study. Lastly, let's move to our 50% here. And so we saw on average from the calculated 50% of the maxes that we saw in our athletes, 50% represented 42.8 miles per hour. So if we move to see how our athletes did, this one was pretty staggering. Average amount off calculated 50% equals 23 miles per hour over the actual 50%. So let's dissect this for a second because that's a lot. Basically what we're saying here is that when we asked an athlete to throw 50%, roughly around 42 miles per hour, these athletes were 23 miles per hour over that, meaning most of them were sitting around 65 for 50%, whereas we wanted them to be around 42 miles per hour, an actual calculated 50%. So let's go on here and let's talk about the individual athlete and how the individual athlete gauged the intensities. So it's one thing to say, you know, we calculated this intensity from a max of 100% all the way back to a 50%, and to say that our athletes as a whole were substantially off. But how consistent were their throws? That's a question that our staff and I wanted to know. How consistent were their throws at these RPEs? And what we saw was pretty interesting and aligns well to what we see in research. So at 100%, athletes were about 0.9 miles per hour throw to throw. Remember, we asked our athletes to throw 2 throws at each RPE, 50, 70, and 100. So when we start off with the 100%, what we saw is that the 2 throws were only about 0.9 miles per hour off at any given time. Now, if we move to 70% though, we start to see a little bit of a change. We see that the athlete is about 2.6 miles per hour up or down. So we start to get a little variance. And then lastly here, we see 50%. And this is where we figured our athletes would struggle the most, and sure enough, they did. We see that our athletes are off throw to throw by about 3.7, almost 4 miles per hour. So let's stop and think about this again for a second. If I'm giving you, the athlete, a recommended workload for the day, I want to know how much work you did, and you're 4 miles per hour off the intensity I'm asking you to throw, that can be a major problem in terms of calculating athlete load. So that brings us to our last part here, our conclusion. Our conclusion is pretty simple. Stop guessing. We want to make this very clear. When you are guessing in terms of intensity or volume as a coach or as a player in your throwing program, we can run into some really big issues by the time season gets here, because you are either going to be substantially overtrained or substantially undertrained, dependent upon how we calculate your intensity or your load. Coaches using RPE models. Number one, I would argue with you that your athletes are never doing the actual RPE you set out for them. So as you build, you might build the best progression in the world, but you're only guessing when the athlete goes to execute, because the athlete, as we saw at 50%, the athletes on average that we had were about 23 miles per hour over. or 8 miles per hour over, or 4 miles per hour under. It's nearly impossible to calculate the actual output. So as we try to build a program that builds with the athlete, we're really missing the key components of how quickly an athlete should progress, or how much control we have over the athlete progressing intensity. We also, when we look at volume, need to understand that how much volume we do is really predicated upon the amount of intensity that the athlete is under. So if we're recommending 5 throws at 100% and this athlete is 4 miles per hour down on their 100%, that means that on our judged load, we probably need to add a few extra throws. But on a static RPE program, that's just not gonna happen. So again, the keys here, RPE programs could lead to injury because they're either over preparing athletes or under preparing athletes, thus causing a fatigue state in the athlete, either when actual season load occurs or during the progression trying to get to season. So our recommendations to athlete, obviously we're a little biased. We have our KP sleeve. It tracks and measures both intensity and volume in every throw and gives you an accurate representation around day load in the athlete daily. This is key. I mean, if you want to prepare on the best trajectory possible for season, the KP sleeve, any other wearable that tracks throwing workload is going to be kind of the key to you getting to where you want to be. So our conclusion on RPE, like we said, like we've seen in research, ultimately RPE is probably not a great model and can lead to injury. It's better than nothing, absolutely. Not making a case for that. But in terms of the most optimal throwing program to make sure you're the most optimally ready for season, KP sleeve, some sort of wearable, tracking daily workload, that's gonna be the key. As always, guys, we appreciate you checking out our channel. And if you love this information, you want more content like it, be sure to subscribe below. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share it with a friend, a coach, a parent. As many of you guys know out there, information is powerful. So if you can get this in the hands of somebody who's drawing up RPE programs, maybe this changes their mind. Maybe this helps another kid out there. Maybe this helps yourself, your team, etc. Guys, questions at any time on things like RPE, spin rate, biomechanics, be sure to shoot us a message, support@KinnectProBaseball.com. If you want to train with us remotely, hybrid, or in-house in Tampa, feel free to reach out, or also check out our website at KinnectProBaseball.com. Appreciate you guys as always. Let's keep climbing.